I hope you hear me. Everything is okay. So thanks very much. And just a couple of introductory remarks. First, Maria, I hope they will be interesting enough. When you mention those caves close to Italian border in the south of Slovenia, Scotian caves, as my friend Mladar Dolar reminded me, the story is much more interesting of those caves. Do you know that Freud mentions in some letter that he also visited, Freud himself, the cave, and when he was at the darkest bottom of the cave, it's really chaotic, hellish-like, he saw a black figure, more of a shadow, approaching him. And when the figure came closer to him, you know who this was? You know who Karl Lueger was? The Viennese mayor at that time, the key influence on Hitler. He was the big anti-Semitic populist politician. This is, in a way, hell. And Freud plays on this. Lüge means lie. And this is a deep Freudian message. In the deepest of our unconscious, you don't discover Jungians think this. You don't discover some deepest truth about more spirituality, whatever. No, you discover the fundamental lie. That's in the unconscious. It's a wonderful story. Another reaction, we should talk later. Now, my books, obviously, I don't know what's happening because it's for the first time that I heard about a book of mine called Outspoken. Now, that's very interesting. Am I already split personality or whatever? Another thing, that freedom book, no? Obviously, Bloomsbury has problems. I have otherwise with them very good relations. Bloomsbury have problems with titles. I like to be provocative there. You know what was my title? Freedom, 2 points, a poison without cure. And they changed it now, and I protested, we'll see, into a new philosophy. No, I meant exactly what I want there. Just two more up to the point remarks. First, please, at least for tomorrow, so that I don't have to repeat what I already published. I don't like doing this. Please read, those of you who didn't. It is mentioned, the coordinates are given on the Bergbeck web page, the presentation of this mini course of mine. Please read my text of belated response to my critics on Buddhism. Please read my text on Buddhism, my response to my critics. It will make things much easier. And second thing, not to disappoint you, today I will not talk a lot about Buddhism, but I will rather present the background situation, horrors mostly happening today, or at least in the 20th century, which confront us with this choice. And it's a great choice. I think these are two ultimately ethical positions, if we cut the crap. Buddhism or authentic Freudian position. How to react to horrors which are going on today. Okay, let me properly begin. In a video that appeared on the web, now, 10 days ago, in April 2023, we see the interaction in the middle of a public ceremony between the Dalai Lama and a 7-year-old boy. The boy is seen asking the Dalai Lama for a hug, following which the leader, Dalai Lama, blessed him, asked him to kiss him, and stuck out his tongue, saying, "Suck my tongue." And if I saw it correctly, this does happen then. Now, many in the West blamed the Dalai Lama for behaving inappropriately and even being a pedophile. The critics pointed out that although sticking out one's tongue is a traditional practice in Tibet, a sign of benevolence, demonstrating that one's tongue is not dark, which indicates evil. The idea is that in the 9th century, there was an evil Dalai Lama, and the myth was that his tongue was black. So, this gesture means basically, look, I'm a good guy. But, as critics pointed out, asking another person to suck your tongue has no place in the Tibetan tradition. But again, Tibetans answered that the correct Tibetan phrase is kelesa, which roughly translates as "eat my tongue." It is used by an older person, like a benevolent grandfather, to express his love for the child. It means something like, "I love you. I give you everything I can, but now I have given you everything, so the only thing left is for you to eat my tongue." The meaning of this common expression, used to tease and teach children, is completely lost in cultural interpretation and its English translation. Because although English is Dalai Lama's second language, he speaks in not so good broken English at public events, often making himself wrong translations, like in this case where "eat" became "suck." But again, the critics pointed out that "kelesa" is a metaphoric expression, not implying that the addressee will really do it, while in this case, the child really sucked Dalai Lama's tongue. Plus, the fact that something is part of a tradition doesn't preclude that it has an obscene or oppressive background. Take the extreme case. Clitoridectomy is also part of a tradition, and the ancient Tibet was full of what we consider today extremely humiliating practices and strict hierarchy. But again, it is no less probable that the wide distribution of this embarrassing clip was orchestrated by the Chinese authorities to besmirch the figure of Dalai Lama, since he personalizes the Tibetan resistance to Chinese domination. So the one thing we can be sure of in this mess is that for a moment we got a glimpse of the Dalai Lama as our neighbor in the strict Lacanian sense of the term. Not our fellow man, somebody like us, but an other who cannot be reduced to someone like us, whose otherness indicates an impenetrable abyss. To complicate things even further, sticking one tongue far out is also part of another ancient tradition in Tibet. Serfs or subordinate persons do this when they encounter a figure of high authority to show their self-humiliation. You should turn your eyes out to basically the message is, look, I'm an idiot, not worthy of you. Plus, in Europe, in most of Europe, to stick out your tongue mostly functions as a rude gesture to indicate mocking disgust or, with children, playful teasing. So we can imagine three persons: a paternal benevolent Tibetan, a subordinate Tibetan, an average European, meeting, each of them greeting the other two with the same gesture of sticking out his tongue and interpreting the others doing the same gesture according to his or her or its understanding. For the paternal Tibetan, it would mean that they all want to be benevolent towards others. For the subordinate Tibetan, it would mean that they are all respectfully submissive. And for the European, that they are all in the mode of playfully teasing each other. In this way, the further exchange among the three could go on smoothly, since this is how many of our communications already function. That's my point. You know, we may read it in different way, but it doesn't matter. Sometimes it works even better. But let's take an example, not to get lost in these exotic examples. Let's take a case from our own culture, which really surprised me. Years ago, when I was reading a text about how the Nazis tortured prisoners in the concentration camps, it affected me quite dramatically when I found that they used industrially made testicle crushers, like, you know, to break nuts or whatever, industrially made testicle crushers to cause unbearable pain. Now I found that this same product, because I wanted to check, is this true or not? So I went to Google, idiot that I am, and put it testicle crushers. And I found that this same product, exquisitely made, is one of the series of similar things one can buy on the web. As the advertisement says, pick your poison for pleasure from this ball torture group. Stainless steel ball crusher, stainless ball clamp torture device, brutal cock vice torture toy, hardcore stainless ball torture. So, if you lie in bed with your partner, melancholic and tired of ordinary sex, I quote again the advertisement now, the time is right. Your slave's nuts are ripe for crushing. It is the moment you have been waiting for, to find the right tool to brutalize his balls. The stainless ball clamp torture device could be the ultimate testicle crusher, giving its wicked, brutal features. Now, if we imagine a scene of two men playing a sexual game with ball crushers, we of course immediately stumble upon ambiguous situations, to say the least. Let's say I by mistake enter a room where two men are playing this game, and since in all probability one of them is moaning and crying because of the pain, I misread this situation as an actual torture and jump in to attack the active guy. If I ignore the situation and just walk by, I ignore the possibility that it was an actual torture. So should I approach the two guys and politely ask them, is what you are doing really consensual? Well, it's an idiotic thing to do. But let's go a step further and imagine a man doing something similar to a woman, torturing her consensually. Many among us would automatically presume that their activity is not consensual. And if it is, that the woman internalized male oppression, identifying with the enemy. The confusion is here irreducible. Unfortunately, there are rare, but there are men and women and trans and so on who authentically enjoy a degree of torture which is non-consensual. Plus, we should recall the obsessional ritual of enacting a punishment to signal the presence of a desire punished by the specific form of the inflicted pain. Let's say that in a culture where rape is published by flogging, somebody asks his friend to flog him brutally. There is no deep masochism at work here. Being flogged simply signals my desire to rape a woman. The passage from the ball crusher used to torture prisoners in Nazi concentration camps to the ball crusher that you can buy for a little bit over $200 to play sadomasochist erotic games will undoubtedly be celebrated as a sign of historical progress. The same progress which brings us classic works of art purified of the content that may hurt somebody. The question that bothers us today is, why does the permissive stance towards sexual pleasure entail impotence and frigidity? Why, when pleasure is enjoined by a superego figure, are we deprived of it? Why, in these conditions, the only way to enjoy is sometimes at least through pain? My point is, only Buddhism and psychoanalysis can provide some sort of an answer to this question, although in two opposite ways. Why Buddhism and psychoanalysis? Because the two can give an answer so that they both shift, that will be my formula for today, shift from focusing on an external enemy to shift from that to immanent antagonism. What characterizes an authentic emancipatory thought and practice is not a vision of conflict-free, harmonious future, but the properly dialectical notion of an antagonism which is totally incompatible with the rightist topic of the need of an enemy to assert our self-identity. Here is, I was even shocked to find it, Martin Heidegger's articulation of the need for an enemy from his course of 1933-1934, the year of his deepest Nazi engagement. A quote, "An enemy is each and every person who poses an essential threat to the Dasein, existence of the people and its individual members. The enemy does not have to be external, and the external enemy is not even always the most dangerous one, and it can seem as if there were no enemy. Then it is a fundamental requirement to find the enemy, to expose the enemy to the light, or even first to make the enemy, so that this standing against the enemy may happen, and so that Dasein, existence, may not lose its edge. The challenge is to bring the enemy into the open, to harbor no illusions about the enemy, to keep oneself ready for attack, to cultivate and intensify a constant readiness, and to prepare the attack, looking far ahead with the goal of total annihilation." End of quote. The most ominous passage is here to expose the enemy to the light, or even first to make the enemy, so that this standing against the enemy may happen. In short, it doesn't even matter if the enemy is a real enemy. If there is no enemy, it has to be invented so that a people may not lose its edge and can prepare for the invented enemies, total annihilation. What we find here is the logic of anti-Semitism at its most elementary. What Heidegger ignores is the possibility that an enemy is invented to create the false unity of the people and thus cover up its own immanent antagonisms. However, just a side remark, one should be careful not to extend this need for an enemy to the entirety of Heidegger's thinking. The passage quoted above is from Heidegger's course of 1933-34, when he was at the high point of his Nazi engagement. At this point, he put forward the notion of folk, people, as a community that needs an enemy. And when he later withdrew from active politics, the notion of enemy changes. It is no longer another ethnic group to be annihilated, but modern technology as such. And one should not fight it, but went through it and gain distance towards it. So when Richard Walling focuses on a spiritualized racial community in his critique of Heidegger, he ignores all too much that there is no place for such a community in Heidegger's masterwork, Being and Time, Sein und Zeit, which is focused on an individual Dasein, existence, thrown into the abyss of a world incidentally. One should also note that the style of Sein und Zeit is totally different from Heidegger's later poetic intimations. It is a systematic book subdivided into numbers, paragraphs, and so on. Now, why is this passage, nonetheless, from Heidegger dangerous? Because I think that what Heidegger is describing, we have a person who brought it to extreme. In his speech to SS leaders in Poznań on October 4th, 1943, Heinrich Himmler spoke quite openly about the mass killing of the Jews as, I quote, a glorious page in our history and one that has never been written and never can be written, end of quote. He then goes on to characterize the ability to do this and to remain decent as the greatest virtue of the Nazis. Quote, to have gone through the extermination of the Jews and at the same time to have remained decent, this is what made us hard, end of quote. Himmler here exactly opposes true principled virtue to ordinary human compassion for a singular human being, another quote. But then they all come along, these 80 million good Germans, and every one of them has his decent Jew. Of course, it's quite clear that other Jews are pigs, but this one is a first-class Jew. End of quote. In short, German knows that Jews as such are pigs, but when they fail to apply this principle to a singular Jew that they know, they become traitors. And Himmler is well aware of what he is saying. He explicitly includes the killing of women and children into this series. Another quote from Himmler. We faced the question, what should we do with the women and children? I decided here to find a completely clear solution. I did not regard myself as justified in exterminating the men, that is to say, to kill them or have them killed, and to allow the avengers in the shape of children to grow up for our sons and grandchildren. The difficult decision had to be taken to have these people disappear from the earth. End of quote. But what makes all this so, sorry to use this term, fascinating is the high ethical language used by Himmler to justify the extermination of the Jews, but also the brutal treatment of the Slavic people under German occupation. Another, a little bit longer quote. One principle must be absolute for the SS men. We must be honest, decent, loyal, and friendly to members of our blood and to no one else. What happens to the Russians, what happens to the Czechs is a matter of utter indifference to me. Whether the other races live in comfort or perish of hunger interests me only insofar as we need them as slaves for our culture. Apart from that, it does not interest me. Whether or not 10,000 Russian women collapse from exhaustion while digging a tank ditch interests me only insofar as the tank ditch is completed for Germany. We have the moral right, we have the duty to our people to do it, to kill these people who want to kill us. But we do not have the right to enrich ourselves with even one fur, with one mark, with one cigarette, with one watch, with anything. End of quote. So Himmler goes to the end here. Further in the speech, he imagines the case of an SS officer on the Eastern Front confronting a Russian mother with a small child, both scared of him, trembling and crying. The soldier's first reaction is understandably compassion. Is really his duty as a soldier to kill these two helpless human beings? Himmler's answer is an unconditional yes. His fidelity is only to the German people, which implies total indifference towards the suffering of the members of other races. Bearing in mind the suffering the German people are exposed by the continuous bombing by the American and British planes, any compassion with the two poor Russians is nothing less than treason for Himmler, an act of ignoring the suffering of one's own people. Was then Himmler a sadist, doing horrible things and gaining surplus enjoyment from his conviction that he is doing just an ethical duty, or doing it for the big other, the good of the German nation? I think this formula is too simple to be applied here. There is something much more horrifying in Himmler. From what one can see by way of reading his letters, he was a terribly normal person. He detested personally witnessing brutality. He was decent and kind to his friends. He was ready to punish SS members for their petty crimes, and as such, as a normal individual, he did in his office what he knew he is doing. It is here that Lacan's claim that normalcy is a form of psychosis acquires its weight. Here, not surprisingly, Himmler comes close, but I don't identify them, to the Buddhist and Hinduist idea that we suffer and do hurtful things if we are too directly involved in what we perceive as reality of objects. So, we should follow the doctrine of non-involvement, of the disinterested action. Act as if it doesn't matter, as if you are not the agent, but things, including your own acts, just happen in an impersonal way. Now, it is difficult to resist here the temptation to paraphrase this passage as the justification of the burning of the Jews in the gas chambers to their executor caught in a moment of doubt. Since he who thinks is to be the killer and he who thinks is to be killed both know nothing, a quote from Bhagavad Gita, the Hinduist sacred text, since the self kills not and the self is not killed, therefore you ought not to grieve for any burned Jews, but looking alike on pleasure and pain, on gain and loss, on victory and defeat. You do what you ordered to do. No wonder that Bhagavad Gita was Himmler's preferred book. It is reported that he was always carrying it in his pocket, in the pocket of his uniform. Does this not hold also for today's military operations, which are more and more done through drones and by just putting buttons? Now, a specification. The same thing cannot be said for people directly working under Himmler. They were openly pathological. If Himmler was at the top of the pyramid of the organizers of the Holocaust, second to him were not well-known names like Heydrich and Eichmann. Not this, but a compatriot of mine. Remember this name, Odilo Globocnik, an Austrian Nazi whose father was a Slovene, as his surname indicates. Globocnik had a leading role in Operation Reinhardt, the organized murder of around 1.5 million Jews of mostly Polish origin in the Majdanek, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec extermination camps. Globocnik originated the concept of the extermination camps and industrialized murder. The historian Michael Allen described him as the vilest individual in the vilest organization ever knows. It was this guy Globocnik, you know, who, when they didn't have enough bullets to kill the Jews, he came to the idea out of his practice. Why don't we redirect exhaust fume back of a car back into the cabin or of a truck? Then his idea was to do this industrially. It's his original idea. But what lurks behind this topic is the question of the big other. The conclusion that imposes itself. It's not that every ethical stance needs some figure of the big other to rely on, but on the contrary, that a truly radical ethical position emerges when the subject is deprived of the support in any figure of a big other, so that it has to make a decision in the abyss of its freedom. Such a decision stands for the moment when ethics gets political, for the moment of the political suspension of the ethical. The subject has to make a decision which cannot be fully grounded in any kind of higher neutral principles. It has to make a decision about how to apply these principles, a decision which always gives them a particular spin. I think this is the case with Antigone. Her decision to risk everything for the proper funeral of her brother cannot be fully grounded in the universal, immemorial rules she evokes. Every human being, independently of his crimes, deserves, or her or their, deserves a proper funeral. She picked out her brother, ignoring all others, and it is this restriction which makes her act political, not just her public declaring of what she is doing. In this decision, Antigone, was not supported by a big other. In some formal sense, Antigone can be said to appear as evil from the standpoint of the existing order, a threat to it. But her evil is ethical, although in a totally different sense than that of Himmler. It opens up a new space for confronting the antagonisms of the existing society, while the function of Himmler's evil is precisely to obfuscate these antagonisms. Now let me move to this more general problem, and with all the focus that I had till now on Holocaust, let me just point out again that I am well aware of the horror of what Israel is now doing on the West Bank, of what this means. It's not just a legal question, what happens with the independence of the legal system and so on and so on. It's the entire logic of basically directly legitimizing state crimes, which Israel is coming close to. What do I mean by this? More and more, I've already talked about this, we are getting close to a situation where the term courage acquires a new meaning. Courage is not simply courage to do good things, to sacrifice yourself for helping out and so on. Courage becomes more and more, from hardliners, from right-wing hardliners to politicians like Donald Trump, courage becomes the courage to, as in Himmler, to break your own legal rules when the situation demanded it. If you show too much sympathy and so on, you don't display true courage. Courage means oppress your elementary ethical sensitivity. But that's another story. I've written about this extensively. Now, back to the big other. A fact from the Bosnian War in the early 1990s makes the same point. Many of the girls who survived brutal rapes killed themselves later, after they rejoined their community and found that there is no one who is ready to listen to them, to accept their testimony. In Lacan's terms, what is missing here is not only another human being, the attentive listener, but the big other itself, the space of the symbolic inscription or registration of my words. One should here critically note that even Jacques Derrida's deconstruction continues to rely on a figure of the big other. When Derrida writes that deconstruction is justice, an impossible justice but still justice, this determination implies that deconstruction doesn't just bring out the inconsistencies and contradictions of a text. The work of deconstruction is led by the impossible ideal of fully bringing out all inconsistencies which legitimize secret forms of domination and oppression. This goal is, of course, infinitely postponed, forever eluding. In the same sense that Derrida talks about democracy to come, justice is always to come. To claim that it is fully here would have been the worst case of what Derrida called metaphysics of presence. However, in spite of the impossibility that pertains to justice, we have to cling to it as a kind of regulative idea. What do you mean by this? I remember years ago talking to a faithful Derridean friend of mine at a reception after a talk. I can name her, it was Avital Ronel. And while we were picking up pieces of fried chicken, she told me, how will we justify doing this at the final Nuremberg trial for the crimes humans commit against animals? The regulative idea is here that an ethical debt is accumulating for all the horrors of the industrial breeding of animals. Just think what we are doing to millions of pigs, which remain half blind and barely can walk. They are just bred to get fat enough as quickly as possible and be slaughtered for our consumption. I respectfully remained silent, but the idea of a gigantic trial of all of humanity by whom struck me as strangely twisted. Do we really have to presuppose such a figure of the big other, a promise that at some final point all debts will be settled? Although we know this moment will never come, is such an idea not deeply anthropocentric, transposing onto the stupid indifference of nature a sense of justice totally absent in it? Cannot we act ethically with regard to animal suffering, although without such a figure of the big other? Back to Himmler. Do we, in all of humanity, not treat animals more or less exactly in the same way Himmler demanded Germans to treat Russian women? Whether or not 10,000 pigs collapsed from exhaustion of being overfed and treated with hormonal chemicals, with no free movement in nature, this interests us only insofar as the quota of pork meat is completed from us humans. Now comes a more tricky question. And Hitler, from what we know, one must concede that although it is unthinkable that Hitler didn't know about the Holocaust, he was probably spared the gory details. When Himmler says that Holocaust is a glorious page, blah, 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 but which will never be written, he doesn't only mean that the extermination of the Jews should not be known to the general public. There are hints that he also meant Hitler himself, the Messiah leading the German nation to a new beginning. The true fidelity to the Messiah, the true courage, is that we do silently and secretly the necessary dirty work of clearing the ground so that the Messiah, Hitler, will be able to realize his grandiose vision. The great act of us, close followers of the Messiah, is to keep him in ignorance, to allow him to pursue his vision in blessed innocence. As a supreme self-sacrifice, Himmler takes upon him the evil, and this properly ethical evil makes him much worse than any form of pragmatic opportunism, which means that fidelity to a principled decision is not enough for an act to qualify as truly ethical. What really matters is how this principle relates to social antagonisms. Does it cover them or does it render them visible? The moment we accept an irreducible antagonism, we accept the fact that the big other doesn't exist, that it is ridden with inconsistencies, lacks, and antagonisms. Now, finally, to conclude for today, to my topic, Buddhism. Where does Buddhism stand here? Buddha's teaching is pragmatic, focused on alleviating suffering and pain. In matters of religion, Buddha was agnostic, not interested in any higher spiritual reality. All that exists is the interconnected, non-substantial flow of phenomena beneath which there is no deep, substantial, divine ground, but just the void. But it is interesting to note how Buddhism, which originally dispensed with all institutional, ritual, and focused solely on the individual's enlightenment and the end of suffering, irrespective of all dogmatic institutional frames, ended up clinging to the most mechanical and firmly entrenched institutional hierarchic frame, and simultaneously in a world conceived as full of spiritual entities. In Theravada Buddhism, there is no omnipotent creator, God of the sort found in Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Gods exist as various types of spiritual being, but with limited powers. The question, of course, is how did Buddhism come to this point? It would have been an utterly non-Hegelian reading if we were to dismiss this movement from pure focus on suffering to institutional rituals as a simple regression. If there is a Hegelian axiom, it is that the flaw has to be located at the very beginning of the entire movement. What then is already wrong with the starting point, the Hinayana version of Buddhism? Its flaw is precisely that to which the Mahayana version reacts, its symmetrical reversal. In striving for my own enlightenment, I regress into egotism in my very attempt to erase the constraints of myself. Consequently, one should not make fun of the superstitious features of Tibetan Buddhism, the step towards ritualization and so on, but to become aware of how this step does the work. It does deliver the goods. It's not relying on a prayer wheel, or more generally, on the efficiency of a ritual, also a means to achieve mindlessness, to empty one's mind and repose in peace. So, in a way, Tibetan Buddhism is faithful to Buddha's pragmatic orientation, ignore theological niceties, just focus on how to help people. Sometimes, following blind ritual is pragmatically the most efficient way to achieve the goal of inner peace. So, where is the problem here? Buddhism accepts the common view that the purpose of life is happiness. To quote Dalai Lama, the purpose of our lives is to be happy. Buddhism just defines this term differently. Here again, a couple of statements by Dalai Lama. Happiness is not something ready-made. It comes from your own actions. When we feel love and kindness towards others, it not only makes others feel loved and cared for, but it helps us also to develop inner happiness and peace. We don't need more money. We don't need greater success or fame. We don't need the perfect body or even the perfect mate. Right now, at this very moment, we have a mind which is all the basic equipment we need to achieve complete happiness. Human happiness and human satisfaction most ultimately come from within oneself. End of quotes. Following Freud, Lacan, on the contrary, asserts death drive as the basic component of our libidinal lives, which operate beyond the pleasure principle. What Lacan calls enjoyment, jouissance, emerges out of a self-sabotage of pleasure. It is an enjoyment in displeasure itself. A Lacanian view, I think, is much closer to Dr. House. I refer to the series. Dr. House, TV series, in one of the episodes, when he tries to diagnosticize a patient, and one of his collaborators mentions that the patient radiates happiness, Dr. House immediately adds happiness to the list of the patient's symptoms of his illness to be explained and abolished. The feeling of happiness is a dangerous symptom, not something we should strive for. And one should add here that the same goes for what is also considered the most spontaneous parental feeling, the immense love of one's small child. Small children are horror embodied, stupid, annoying, smelling bad, breaking our sleep. So, again, as Dr. House says at some point, The feeling of love for them is a clear case of what is called the Stockholm Syndrome, a coping mechanism to a captive or abusive situation. When people develop positive feelings towards their captors or abusers over time. Again, this, I think, is the exact mechanism of how we cope with small children. Now, just to conclude, so what about the desperate Lacano-Buddhist attempt? There are some Buddhists which try to, more of this tomorrow, to be at the same time Lacanian, to read what Buddhism calls nirvana as basically the same stance as that signaled by Lacan's traversing the fantasy. We cannot simply dismiss this as a gross misunderstanding of Lacan, because there is a grain of truth in it. Desire is metonymic. Every empirical positive object that we desire is a trap, in the sense that if we get it, our desire is not fully satisfied but disappointed. We experience ce n'est pas ça, this is not that what we really desire. So let's drop our attachment to particular objects and just persist surfing along them from one to another object. In other words, a true betrayal of our desire is precisely our full attachment to a particular object as the true object. If we renounce this, if we maintain a distance towards every object, we attain peace. We are faithful to our desire, to the void in its heart, which cannot be abolished by any object. But, I claim, this logic ultimately fails. For Lacan, desire in its purity, considered without an empirical object of desire, cannot be transformed into a peaceful integration into a non-substantial changing multiplicity of our reality, because desire is as such a gesture of breaking up the balance of reality. If we subtract particular objects, we get the gesture of breaking up, of disturbing the balance as such. What any particular empirical object of desire obfuscates is not the balance of a void, but this negative gesture. Any particular object particularizes this rupture as such, transforming it into a desire for something that positively exists. Just now, to conclude a political variation on this, recall Lacan's basic formula of hysterical desire. I ask you what? To refuse what? What I offer you. Why? Because that's not it. This exactly, I think, should also be the reaction of the victim of racism or sexism to the endless process of the pseudo-liberal left, offering them more and more concessions. Let's rewrite classic texts to make them acceptable to today's sensibilities, and so on. Let's purify our daily language so that they becomes the pronoun for all those who don't want explicitly to be addressed as he or she. Let's destroy the monuments to all figures from the past who said or did something that is today considered problematic, and so on. The answer of the oppressed should be, sorry, but that's not it. You are bombarding me with such offers just to retain your basic social position of superiority. So when Lacan proposes his formula of hysteric provocation, I ask you to refuse what I offer you because that's not it. We should go to the end here and enact the passage from giving or having to being. A hysteric does not just endlessly reject what the other offers, him or her or them, because that's not it, what he, she, they really want. He, she, they finally realizes that the it, that it is the other itself. The message is, you are not it. You are not in a position to give me what I really need or want. But notice a specific reversal in Lacan's formula. It's not me, the victim, demanding something from a figure of the big other who is complaining about it. I refuse what you are offering me because that's not it. That's not what Lacan says. Lacan says that it's the other itself who asks me to refuse its offer because that's not it. Do we not get here an extreme version of the offer meant to be rejected? A form of politeness in our daily lives. You know this example, I used it dozens of times. When I invite my poor friend to an expensive dinner, it is clear to both of us that I will pay the bill. However, at least in my country, it is expected that my friend will insist for a short time that he should pay the bill. And then, as expected, he concedes that I will pay it. So, can Lacan's formula of hysteria, I demand you to reject what I offer you because it's not that, can it not be read also as a formula of an authentic power structure, government? The message of such a power to the subject should not be, we give you whatever you want or need, or even we give you what you really need, even if you are not aware of it. It is rather, we give you what we can, but we know well this is not that. Imagine that in the midst of the COVID pandemic, a government's message would have been, we are doing all we can, we organize all the measures, vaccination, lockdowns, but this is not that. And the same holds for global warming and so on. Unfortunately, there is also a more cynical reading of this formula. We give you all the rights and so on, but that's not it. Beneath all this, there is the fact that our raw power, the fact of our raw power, we can do what we want. We don't really serve you. This gap, I think, is constitutive of power, which means that hysterical power is impossible. Power has to pretend or act as if it is actually pure power. I think I used my 1 hour. This is what I have for now, and tomorrow we go into Buddhism in detail, because I think that precisely at this point, as many intelligent Buddhists are aware of, precisely at this point, Buddhism oscillates between total compassion, I postpone my entry into nirvana till all living beings, not only humans, will be redeemed of their pain, and this, under quotation marks, egotist self-withdrawal. I enter nirvana, that's it. Why and how this happens, I will explain tomorrow, and I will also explain what interests me most, in what sense the lesson of psychoanalysis is here the Hegelian one, that of desire, which is not return to peace, but desire is a violent fragmentation, imbalance. Do not betray your desire precisely means be faithful to your crazy choice. It's time to stop. Thanks very much. Maria, take over.
I'm here. I'm not going to take over. The audience will take over. But meanwhile, I just wanted to thank you very much. Obviously, you left us wanting more. You also some bits of it were very difficult to listen to. But nevertheless...
sorry to tell you this, but you know what was my point here? I was, again, this safe space logic. To prevent things like this happen in reality, we have to talk about them.
Okay.
And I'm sincerely perplexed here. You know, I don't have easy answers, and maybe that's a solution, but I'm sorry.
No, but then we'll all have more nightmares. But we also have lots of...
better nightmares than things like this happening to you in reality, you know.
I agree. So, no, it's open to the audience to ask any questions. I'm looking at the chat, and there isn't at the moment. Elia, you can't see anything either, is there? Maybe I could ask something, unless I haven't. Elia, is there anything there? I can't see anything in the chat.
Not yet.
Not yet. So everyone, do feel free to start writing questions about today's lecture or anything else you are burning to ask Zizek. Until we get some more questions, I wouldn't mind asking you, Slavoj, a bit more about, I mean, maybe it's coming tomorrow, as you promised, but a bit more about Buddhism and vis-a-vis Hegel rather than vis-a-vis Lacan and Freud. I mean, obviously, the death drive that you started describing is the big distinction or the big divorce between Buddhism and psychoanalysis version of happiness. But I do have, you're really good at sort of pithy little comments in your talks as well as your book. So, and I don't know, I can't remember where this particular one came from. And whenever I'm in doubt, I assume it came from Less Than Nothing. But anyway, at some point, you don't remember either where your own comments come from. So let's say it was from Less Than Nothing. But you say something like, the Buddhist question, the big Buddhist question is, how do we get out of illusion, the illusory ego? How do we get out of suffering? Whereas the Hegelian question is, how did we fall into it? And I wonder if you can say a bit more about that, how the Hegelian question might be more productive or stimulating for our predicament than the Buddhist question about how do we get out of suffering or how do we get out of illusion. Could you say a bit more about that?
No, first I would, let's hope people will raise some, I hope, aggressive question, but the reason, I wanted to make it clearer tomorrow, and I will. The reason I focused on this example disgusting of Himmler is that, whenever I read, and I read them often, Buddhist texts, they always sound, sorry for using this term, but it's appropriate, Deleuzian to me. Deleuzian in the sense that against fixity, I put it like this. For intelligent Buddhists, as you will hear tomorrow, nirvana does not mean you withdraw yourself from full experience of reality and you are in some kind of a purely spiritual blessed state. You just accept what they call the pure interrelatedness of phenomena. Things do not have a substantial existence on their own. Things are interconnected, so that what thing is only its relations to other things. And for Buddhists, they like, some of them again, to refer to Deleuze here, because their point is that nirvana, in some sense, doesn't mean, again, withdrawing from reality, but even fully immersing yourself into reality. You just don't substantialize reality, neither your ego nor objects, into a firm entity which is exempted from this eternal intermingling flow of appearances, and so on and so on. So, as many of them say, Buddhism is not an escape from reality, it is full immersion into the multiple, ultimately flexible flow of appearances. And they criticize, sometimes even in a very naive, empiricist way, along the lines of Bergson or even some empiricists, they criticize intellectualism. For them, the original evil is when we analyze things intellectually, we isolate into parts what in reality belongs together. For Hegel, the way I read it, and for Lacan, let's not go into details now, this disassembling of reality, you are in a complex reality, but you say, no, exactly, only this matters. This is, for example, the phenomenon of love at its purest. For our tradition, love is not this peaceful Buddha smile, I love all creatures. No, love is, I love you, and I basically don't care if all other things fall apart. And this is the procedure of understanding. You tear apart what belongs together. The elementary form of this is imagination, which is why imagination plays a key role in Freud, fantasies, but also already in German idealism, from Kant to Hegel. Hegel already pointed out that transcendental imagination is Kant's greatest conceptual achievement. So, for Hegel, our rational categories are not a prison from which we should liberate ourselves into some kind of a free immersion into creative flux. For Hegel, this ability to cut into pieces what in reality is together, this ability to take a flight and take a flight into different dimensions to recombine realities. This is the ultimate reference of our freedom. This is love. This is where do we find this in cinema? I think he is the ultimate Hegelian, you will not believe me, director today. Although I don't like all of his films, Quentin Tarantino, you know, when in his Inglourious Bastards and some other movies, he simply changes well-known historical reality. Hitler is killed there and so on, and there is such a liberating effect in this. It makes you retroactively aware of how contingent is what effectively happened. I think that the great achievement of Hegelian dialectics is not to see a deeper necessity in what appears as a contingency, but to see the contingency of what appears to us as a necessity. So again, this is for me the ultimate choice. Either you enter nirvana, and I mean this now in an authentic sense, not this spiritual, you are not here. No, you are fully here. Either you do this, or you accept what Buddhists try to get rid of, this intellect, cutting the unity, mortifying even it, as the very resource of our freedom.
Okay, that's a beautiful answer. have you written the stuff on Quentin Tarantino as a Hegelian? That's a beautiful. Thank you. That's an example.
My wife Yela is doing this.
Who's doing that?
My wife Yela is now
writing. All right, I have to look for what you write.
Because I listened with her. She told me an interview with Tarantino, and it shows nicely. I forgot which interview how he works his mind. He talks about that movie, which is not one of my favorite one, a pseudo Western remake. How is it called? Seven, I don't know what. Where a black, where a black guy is extremely brutal, humiliates whites, and so on and so on. And he, again, or in Inglorious Bastards, where he presents even some Germans as funny and so on. Tarantino is a master of breaking out of bad cliches, precisely the cliches of authenticity. Tarantino's ultimate message is that we need more creative faking. Just don't be authentic.
That's brilliant. Okay, I'd like to...
I got some questions. Maybe you have some questions now.
Yeah, we've had a few more. So, Maxim, I will come back to you. I'll just take them in the order in which they've arrived, and they're all very good questions.
Yeah, but you should be also a Stalinist and made a selection.
Yeah, but I'm liking all of them so far, and some of them could chime in with things I was going to ask. So, let me start with Filippo. Oh, no, that's an earlier one. Oh, my God, there's a lot. Okay, John... can you say more about the distinction between an ethical position that obfuscates antagonism versus an ethical position that exposes antagonism? How does one identify the antagonism to be exposed? Can you say something about that, or shall I read a few more questions before, or do you want to respond to that?
No, let's go one by one, because I'm getting old and senile, and I can... I forget. So let me I will try to be brief here. It all depends what do you mean as antagonism. Let me give you the simplest possible example. It's boring, I always return to it, but precisely because I think, with all my unwavering support for West Bank Palestinians, that anti-Semitism is structurally the purest matrix of ideology. That's why my critique of Israel, state of Israel, and the predominant politics today is precisely that they practice some kind of anti-Semitic Zionism. I was so glad to notice that Gideon Levy and some critical intellectual in Israel also began to use this term, anti-Semitic Zionism.
Yeah.
So I will try to explain it precisely, what's the difference between the enemy antagonism. Himmler, as I said, if you define ethics simply as being faithful to your principle, to your idea of the good, disregarding consequences for you, then I'm sorry, Himmler was an ethical person. Other Nazis were not. Goering was grabbing artworks. Himmler was a horror, the true horror. But why is anti-Semitism in itself a non-ethical position? Because to put it in the simplest possible terms, the question is not, I'm repeating myself what I said here many times already, the problem with anti-Semitism is not is its image of the Jew true or not. The moment you do this, you miss the point. We shouldn't debate, but did the Jews really exploit them? No. The true point is, why do to turn critically the Heidegger's point. Why did the Nazis need the Jew as an enemy? Why did they have to construct it? Isn't it clear? They say it openly. It's in order to obfuscate the basic class struggle, antagonism, and so on. Because they project social tension, a tension that is inscribed into the very social order. They project it onto an external cause. No, we are in ourselves a organic community. The trouble comes from the outside. And at a different level, I've written enough about the difference between the two of them. Isn't it quite similar with, I repeat it at a different level, with Stalinist purges? When there were problems, instead of admitting something is wrong with our project of Stalinist centralized fast industrial development and so on, no, they needed to account for their problems an external enemy. Trotskyites, Nazi agents, and so on. And they even then used this wonderful logic where you unite all your enemies even if they come from opposite camps, you know. Like Nazis like to talk about the Judeo-Bolshevik plot. Stalinists like to talk about the Trotskyite Bukharin, like all opponents are basically one of the same, organized from outside, and so on and so on. So this would be an example. An emancipatory thing is not to focus on the enemy, but to ask the question, even if there is an enemy, I'm not saying there are no enemies, but to ask the question, what are our inner contradictions, tensions, social struggles that the enemy can exploit them? I had debates with many of my friends recently from Iran, where with this, it's a wonderful, I think it's a world historical event, this Iranian resistance movement, incredible courage, triggered by women, by protesting women. And again, the authorities are playing the game. This is under foreign influence, foreign agent, Western multiculturalism, feminism. No, even if it is, it's really not Eurocentric, because protesters who, not many of them even, protesters who use sometimes Western language, human rights, blah, 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 they use simply the language which is at their disposal, but they use it to articulate their own antagonism, problems, and so on. And Alenka Zupancic, I don't know if it's already published, she gave this as a talk in Montreal recently, not yet published, wrote a wonderful text where she points out how the Iranian protest movement is precisely this. That's not it, what you are offering us. You know, like when those in power say, okay, we will relax it a little bit, and so on and so on. That's why in an authentic, radical, emancipatory movement, you demand something, but the reaction is always, that's not it. But that's another topic which will maybe create me friends, but also enemies. That's also what conditions my sympathy for Afro-pessimism, this most radical trend. Because their idea is precisely white liberals. Do you want more? Shall we censor more white books, more of this? No, that's not it. That's not it. You are doing this so that the basic relations remain the same. You want to integrate us into your ideological, political frame. This is what is for you openness. But for us, this frame itself is already twisted, wrong, and so on. Okay, not to lose time, but you see my point. That would have been my idea. Always focus on an immanent antagonism.
Okay, next question from Jean. Dr. Ambedkar, the untouchable hero, emancipated millions of untouchables from centuries of oppression through a mass shift from Hinduism to Buddhism. This is an excellent achievement of Buddhism. Please comment.
Oh no, but okay. I mean, if anything, I admire Ambedkar, and this was again one example of how some radical Hinduists focus on declare, if you criticize them from the position of Buddhist egalitarianism, they criticize you for introducing Western concepts. Years ago, when I was in New Delhi, I precisely defended Ambedkar, his stance against castes. I don't know all about this debate, but I know it pretty much in detail. Because you know that even Gandhi played a suspicious game here. As some of my Indian friends reminded me, you know, we all remember the movie Gandhi, Ben Kingsley, and so on. How he, but you know, read, they are available now, read his texts from that era. His idea was not egalitarianism. He saw Indians as in between the blacks, excluded, and the white, somewhere in between, oppressed, but not as strongly as black. And he, Gandhi, did not demand pure egalitarianism, end of apartheid. He explicitly just focused on we Indians should be accepted like the white. He wanted his subgroup to be integrated into the upper, and also in India itself, with all respect for Gandhi and so on, he still wanted to retain a place for castes. Just his formula was even the lowest castes are children of God. A kind of a more harmonious view, every caste has its own dignity, its proper place. And then Ambedkar went further and want abolition of castes. And when I mentioned this, I was quite shocked how I was instantly attacked by some Hinduists that when I'm against castes, that I act as a colonizer, that I want to introduce Western categories of egalitarianism into specific Indian culture, and so on and so on. You see, so precisely that's why I like people like Ambedkar. As for Ambedkar and Buddhism, you know, I'm not abstractly against Buddhism. Buddhism is extremely serious, the most radical position. Buddhism is in some sense radically egalitarian. You know that Buddha himself, this was the greatest taboo, at the end considered that women also should be fully included into their communities. He went far, but what intrigues me is how then, very soon afterwards, a couple of centuries, in Tibet, for example, how this same Buddhism was transformed in order to justify the most radical social hierarchy that you can imagine. So I think that, and that's what I will try to do tomorrow, I think that Buddhism, that there is a tension in Buddhism, and I'm not saying only in Buddhism, obviously also in Marxism, blah, 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 but that there is an ambiguity in Buddhism in the sense that it can be read as radically emancipatory, but it can also be read as let's change nothing, just acquire inner freedom and society remains the same, you will just suffer less. So you don't have to, I think you don't have to convince me of anything here. I think Buddhism is something absolutely incredible here, much more serious. It's another thing, I maybe will mention it tomorrow. My friend Lorenzo Chiesa, who now co-authored with Adrian Johnston a book on Lacan and atheism, points out how this Western mystical reading of Buddhism is totally wrong. Buddhism is not a mysticism. Mysticism means access to divine jouissance. You identify with God and you, as it were, swim in God's jouissance. Buddhism is totally non-mystical. Nirvana is not divine jouissance. Nirvana is stepping out of desire into a void. And this void is not the void of jouissance. It's the most radical position. Sorry, let's go on.
Okay, brilliant. All right, we carry on tomorrow. Maxim Chang wanted to ask something using his microphone. Are you there?
Yeah.
Max.
Hi everyone. And thank you, Zizek. I'm Tibetan, and I'm studying specifically Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist art. So
then you know more than me. Then you
no. Of course you know more. Of course, like I.
No, I don't know. Why should I?
No, I just.
But I would like from you an honest. I'm not bluffing. An honest criticism, maybe even more tomorrow than today. Like where I am wrong, to put it bluntly.
I think it's great. I think your interpretation of how Buddhism is a active, even social, cultural, philosophical engagement with the reality. I think that just reminds me of Haiku by Basho, a Zen Buddhist. He talked about there's an ancient pond, there's a frog, plop. So fundamentally, it's about the be at oneness in Buddhism and how you could interact with the reality. Like you also talked about interconnectedness and okay.
Yeah.
I'll just ask the question. Sorry, I'm a bit excited.
Attack me. I want to pull behind your back a knife out.
Yeah, I've been reading your books and stuff. It's just crazy. Okay. So my question is, precisely, what is your research methodology, and how can it be juxtaposed back into the historical, philosophical, and cultural context? It's quite general, but I kind of want to hear it. Thank you.
Oh my God, this is, now I will make a very honest admission. I was always used simply to doing things. I never asked myself what I'm doing. What attracts me, and this is what I learned from Hegel and from Freud and so on. I believe in the power of simple examples, not simple, everyday examples, like something small happens, and if you analyze it, it may appear in itself insignificant, but it offers a key to many things around. Like that's why that story, and I tried to be fair, I hope you noticed, Dalai Lama, that please, I hope others are also interesting. Tell me, did I miss some point? I tried honestly to bring in all the aspects, against, for, arguments. Please, did I miss something?
I think it's great.
Add something there.
From my point of view, it's great. There's definitely like a historical and cultural connotation in the Tibetan society we have, but also there's definitely.
Yeah, but sorry to interrupt you, but the problem is this one. Okay, you have all this, and I know that showing your tongue has this benevolent meaning that I mentioned. Grandfather, eat my tongue, I give you everything. But that also it has, I read in a sympathetic book to Buddhism, that this was some ritual when Tibet was still feudal, that if a lower serf met a master, you had to step out of the path and like humiliate all that. But I'm here a little bit more perverse, like I know the expression eat my tongue. But wasn't this meant as a metaphor?
I think simply because I don't particularly research into this, but from my personal like experience, it's just like a way of saying hello.
But not really doing it.
Saying hello. But, maybe I was writing on my uncle's book.
Do you usually really do it, or just like hello?
We do it. We do it just to show.
No. You do this, but do you expect the other to suck your tongue?
No. That's the case here.
That's the problem, no?
Yeah. That's a little bit problematic with this, of course.
No, but I try to be. No. Just to finish. I try to be honest. You know why? Because I think that of course we should support Tibetan resistance. I know how Chinese try to infiltrate Tibet. Now, I think in Lhasa there are already more Chinese than Tibetans now, all that stuff. But precisely, I think the worst thing to do is to idealize wrongly Tibetans. You know, let's not elevate them into saints. Yeah. Because the moment you do this, you get caught into position. Every nation has its up and down. For example, I mentioned that Dalai Lama, 9th century, who was supposed to be evil, black tongue. But didn't you also have another Dalai Lama? I read him with pleasure, from I don't know which century, who was almost a pornographic Dalai Lama.
He
around and so on, you know. Yeah. And this is for me a wonderful openness of the culture. You know?
He writes a lot of the pornographic poetries, but to invoke, like what you said, this idea of mindfulness, this idea of, let's just say mindfulness.
And he is still taken seriously.
Yeah.
I mean, he's part of Tibetan tradition. They don't censor him in Tibetan tradition.
Yeah, never.
Because, you know, that's what I want to say. To know really a culture, I don't want to know just the idealized image. I like to know its, how should I put it? I like to learn its inner tensions, who hates whom, what are the oppositions, and so on and so on. You know,
it's more like a culture.
Can I ask you another question? The last one. I'm sorry, I'm losing time. Is it true or not? I heard a rumor, which is beautiful to be true, but I'm interested in. Do you know? You know when Dalai Lama in 59 or when oscillated, could he leave Tibet to India or not? The rumor is that there was some sacred medium who took some drugs and then spoke with spirits and gave him the advice to leave. The idea is that now they discovered some documents that this sacred medium was on the payroll of CIA. So he was told what to. This is not to humiliate Tibetans, but that's how reality works. I love this. You know which was for me the greatest Chinese obscenity? You know that couple of years ago, Dalai Lama proposed that they dispense with tradition. We live in modern times. Why shouldn't the new Dalai Lama be elected?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And then I had to laugh. The Chinese official reaction was, oh, Dalai Lama is violating the sacred Tibetan traditions.
Yeah, exactly. It's very...
This is the brutality of politics. How Chinese all of a sudden can become, if it fits them, the protectors of the sacred traditions and so on and so on. You know. Sorry, let's change. Thanks very
Yes.
much.
Thank you very much for joining, Maxim. Hopefully you'll be there tomorrow when Zizek can ask you more questions tomorrow. Because Zizek was to ask you more stuff, but there's a few more questions waiting, quite a few more questions actually waiting.
Yes.
So let's carry on. Okay, Philip Hosieri, this is a nice question about the concept of time in Buddhism and psychoanalysis. What do you think about the idea of time between Buddhism and psychoanalysis, where Buddhism and the new modern psychotherapies, mindfulness, are focused on the right here, right now, the Hic and Nunc, whilst psychoanalysis is focused on the past of the patient? So, do you want to say something about the concept of time?
No. It's a mega question, you know, and it reaches not only psychotherapy philosophy. I'm not saying I understand quantum mechanics, but you know that now we are at an extremely important moment with regard to quantum mechanics, because now they are returning big ontological questions. No? The Copenhagen orthodoxy was, don't think but calculate, how they put it. No? Formulas work, don't ask what they mean ontologically. What is reality, what is not. Now this is returning, and there are two tendencies. As for Buddhism, I admit it, I don't really know enough about this topic. I just know that, for example, but I will return to Buddhism. In quantum mechanics, you have, on the one hand, those who try to revitalize Einstein's idea. Okay, I'll put it like this. The ultimate agreement is that if we want to reach some kind of ultimate reality, whatever this means, one of the two basic dimensions will have to be sacrificed, either time or space. They cannot be ontologically equal. Then we have, some following Einstein, who at some point proposed the hypothesis that universe is at its most basic level timeless, and that time is only emerges because of our limitation. Time means we cannot see everything at once. There is time because we humans are limited spatially. On the opposite hand, there are people like Rovelli and others who, and this is for me much more attractive, who think that space is an effect of temporary interaction. So at this level, for me, to answer directly the question, no, psychoanalysis, even when it talks about the past, is never really about the past. It is how the past is present now. Psychoanalysis don't use like even those big traumas, like the way people read, for example, Wolfman, who the origin was that when he was in a cradle, 2 years old or whenever, he by mistake saw his parents copulating in the dog style at ergo. No, but already Freud shows that this was just a neutral memory for him. Only later did Wolfman elevate this into what mattered to him. Each epoch retroactively constructs its own past. Not invented, but past is past. I'm not a magician. What happened really happened. But past can acquire a different meaning in each epoch. So again, psychoanalysis here is absolutely focused on the present. And it's the typical move of psychoanalysis is not Jungian, look at the old archetype, but we project into old archetypes something that contingently happens here now in our time. And Lacan makes this clear also, that when he says that the psychoanalytic notion of repetition and so on is not simply temporal development. Repetition means a moment of the past, how a moment from the past becomes a moment, as the moment of the past becomes the moment of our present. Even at the level of big ideologies, we can see what is happening now. For example, the most ridiculous example, a political example. I was quite shocked how, for example, what Israel is doing now. The problem, of course, is how can West Bank be their land when they were 2,000 years ago thrown out, and not by the Arabs, but by the Romans, you know. The Romans threw them out. And historically, Jews till end of 19th century had pretty good relations with Arabs. For example, I read a Jewish historian who pointed out that, you know, when Saladin liberated Jerusalem back from Crusaders, you know that one of the first public edicts of Saladin was a call to Jews, now it's safe for you to return. And there are documents which even point out that some Jews were fighting with the Arabs against the Crusaders, Saladin's forces. So what I'm saying is that I read an interview with Netanyahu podcast, which is horrible. His story is this one. It's not Romans, it's today's Arabs who threw the Jews out till 5th, 6th century. And then today's Palestine was more or less an empty land. And then only after 1860, 70, when Jews began to return there, they developed industry, better farming, for which they needed Arab workers. So that Jews brought today's Palestinians back when they were returning to. I mean, this is a clear example of a crazy rewriting of history. Remember that a battle for the future is always a battle from the past. The first thing to do when you fight for a different future is to change the past, not to change in the sense of imagination and so on, but to throw a new light onto the past. And it's today this is extremely important.
Okay, I notice we've only got 5 minutes left and at least 5 more questions, including a postscript by Filippo who asked the last question, saying that we should also bear in mind...
But if they want, but it will be after
Shall I read them? Shall I put them all together or...
Go together and then I will do whatever I can, okay.
All right, the next one is about the similarities between Buddhism and nihilism. Do you want to talk a little bit about the similarities?
No, I think that nihilism, in the sense in which we use the term today, is a typical European phenomenon. And what we find in other civilizations is state of despair, existential despair. For example, some of my friends visited those countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, where people simply stopped talking about the future. Life is a despair, you just worry about how to survive. Well, this is not nihilism. Nihilism is, and Buddhism, don't confuse nihilism with celebration of the void of nothing or whatever. Buddhism is not in this sense nihilism. I think, again, it's something totally different. No overlapping here. Okay, let's go on. Sorry,
the next one, actually, Thomas, is a very, very wide one that I think we might come back tomorrow about, to say a bit more about desire and its relation to the self. Another one from Heath.
Sorry,
Heath.
just to quickly answer this one.
Yes.
What do we mean by self? Because the whole point of Lacan and Freud is that don't confuse subjectivity with self in the sense of self-image or your conscious self-awareness and so on. The whole point of the unconscious is that you know things of which you are not aware. And in this sense, desire is disconnected from the self. What you really desire, you more than usually, predominantly, you hate it, you reject it. This even often happens with love. People are telling me, okay, male chauvinist experience, my friends are telling me how first a certain woman was getting on her nerves, they distracted them, they were annoyed by her, and then all of a sudden they got it. My God, it's because I already love her. You know, like this, Lacan points out, desire is not what I want. Desire is usually precisely what I don't want. So again, we have to take seriously Lacan's idea of the divided self and distinguish between subject and self-awareness of an ego.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I don't know if you want to carry on. We've only got 1 minute left.
One more. Okay, one more.
Okay, one from Heath about Himmler and his interest in Eastern philosophy. Is it possible, he asks, whether the contemporary right, i.e. Q, Anon, Trumpism, Putin, might attempt to adopt esotericism in the same way that Nazis did?
There are attempts, for example, a friend from Brazil sent me a text. I kind of was able to read it with my half knowledge of blah, 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 which points out that, you know, when was it, in the 70s, I think, there was a military dictatorship in Brazil, and they have secret police doing the usual stuff, torturing, killing illegally people, and to come to terms with what they are doing.
you.